Bitcoin's now reached the point. It's not quite gold. Gold is a $20 trillion asset. Bitcoin's a $2 trillion asset. If you're going to make that play right now, just like those are the relative proportions that you got to work with, right? And so if Bitcoin were to monetize relatively more than gold, then if we hold more Bitcoin than most of our adversaries, then we stand to gain in this sort of global economic reordering. But then any prudent strategic planner has to consider different scenarios over like the longer term. And if Bitcoin is part of that initial play, what would that look like as like a future trajectory, right? Like then you're potentially then have to realistically consider future scenarios, not too far out, 5, 10, 15 years, where Bitcoin is monetizing to close to parity with gold. But then you consider a second scenario, which is, okay, it reaches parity with gold, right? Which would now be a dramatic, much more significant shift in the balance sheets of large portfolios, and where Bitcoin is seen essentially as like a digital gold reserve asset.
Matthew Pines, good to see you, man.
Good to see you again.
How's everything going down there in DC? You've been busy.
Times they are changing, so just trying to ride the tiger.
So when we initially talked about doing this show, we were going to cover your speech that you gave in MENA. But since then, you've dropped an executive order piece with BPI, and you've teased the letter that you're going to write for Scott Bessent. So I think we're going to have to get into them. We'll see if we have time to get around to the MENA thing. But first of all, let's start with the executive order. Do you want to take just like a big overview on that and explain what you've done?
Certainly. So this idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve was sort of like a meme, right? Like, what would it look like if the U.S. government were to create such a thing, right? And I think the original articulation of this idea was put forward at Bitcoin Nashville by both President Trump and Senator Lummis, as well as RFK, and it kind of ran the gamut from on the certain more signaling end, just drawing a box around the existing holdings of Bitcoin the U.S. government has as a result of these criminal proceedings and essentially committing not to sell them. And on the high end, it was essentially RFK laying down a marker of acquiring up to 4 million Bitcoin, right? And then and then in the middle, Senator Lummis had introduced her Bitcoin Act, which targeted 1 million. So that was kind of like set the terms or the frame of this kind of idea. But it wasn't like fleshed out in like operational detail, right? Like what are the legal authorities, both on the executive side, to create such a thing, and then what would be necessary on the legislative side to sort of codify or expand executive action. And that's what BPI does, is do policy research. It's like you have an idea for something related to Bitcoin. What are the both intellectual merits or demerits of such a policy, and then operationally, right? Like what would underpin it from an either existing law or future law. So that's that's sort of in our wheelhouse. So that's what we have done. Kind of did some research on the executive side, what existing laws are available, what existing funds are available. If the president were to decide this is a policy he wants to actually implement, what's the most effective, what's the most justified, what's the most sort of advantageous way of executing such a policy. And so that's what we designed in that executive order. Again, just our take put out there for comment. Obviously, it stimulates lots of discussion. That's kind of what you want to have happen is folks in a broad range of communities and different perspectives kind of chew it up, add feedback. Ideally, it gets to a point where it reaches a really good spot, and if that's what you want, good policy.
So why did BPI do this right now? Were you asked by the Trump administration to draft something, or is this something you've just gone out on your own and done?
Well, after politicians came to Bitcoin Nashville and articulated such a thing, at least I and other folks at BPI were like, okay, is there a plan written down? Is there an executive order? Or, Bitcoin, the Bitcoin Act was introduced in law, but it wasn't clear like what would this look like if an incoming administration were to want to execute it. So I just started doing research on like, okay, like if President Trump were to do this, right, how would it be done? And so we just started drafting it, and it was put out there. So we'll see. I don't have no idea, if someone in the Trump administration will take that or do their own version or whatever, right? But at least we wanted to put out what we felt was a solid proposal to implement such a policy.
All right, let's dig into the actual draft letter. I've not done my full course on executive order influencer yet, so a lot of this is kind of new to me. In terms of, this is structured within the Exchange Stabilization Fund. Can you explain what that actually means?
Yeah, so when we're doing our research on if the president wanted to establish something like a strategic Bitcoin reserve, as I mentioned, on the low end, he could just essentially do it as a signaling, right? He could just take the existing coins, commit not to sell them, and could instruct the government to like do a bunch of studies and do a bunch of reports on, what it would look like to expand that SBR. So that's still a live option, right? I think that would still be a quite strategic move by the United States to create something like an SBR, to call a certain collection of Bitcoin in its custody its strategic Bitcoin reserve, would still be a significant move. But that wouldn't require any additional mechanisms for funding, for purchasing, for custody, because those existing coins are custodied by a third party custodian. And so that's an option, and that's kind of relatively well established. Doesn't require any sort of new mechanisms or funding sources. And so, if you wanted to build on that stockpile, if you wanted to build, add to that reserve, you need funds, right? And you need funds that the administration has existing legal authority to use to purchase Bitcoin, which is okay. Well, that's a novel thing, right? You need to like find the right mechanism. And we did a lot of research in different candidate ways, right, that this could be established. And the one that we felt, or that I felt, and we debated it in terms of how we wanted to formulate our proposed executive order, but the most tractable, feasible, and justified, existing authority is the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, which was amended in 1977, and it created this Exchange Stabilization Fund, and essentially, which is, it's in certain prosaic terms like a slush fund for the Treasury Secretary. It has been used for a lot of different things, both like currency interventions as well as loans to different governments. It was the pot of money that Congress sort of dumped hundreds of billions of dollars of COVID funding to do all sorts of loan guarantees and sort of emergency relief after COVID. So it's sort of like the Treasury Secretary's sort of like rainy day fund, slush fund for all sorts of things. But it's not completely blanket authority, right? It has specific statutory construction where it essentially gives the Treasury Secretary the authority to, under the obligations of the U.S. government to the International Monetary Fund agreement on orderly exchange rates, the Treasury Secretary essentially is authorized to deal in gold, foreign exchange, or other instruments of credit and securities. So that's the core clause, right? And so when we were researching this, Bitcoin is not named in that statute. Is there a legal, clear way to interpret some of those clauses in a way that would allow the government to purchase Bitcoin? Now, Bitcoin is clearly not gold. You can't squirrel out of that one. And you could maybe argue that it's foreign exchange in the sense that it's, say in El Salvador used as legal tender. But it's a bit thin. If you look at the sort of precedent and existing statutory definitions of foreign exchange, essentially it's currency issued by a sovereign. And Bitcoin is not currency issued by a sovereign, right? But it's clearly not that. So that might be a bit of a thin read to stand on. And then you're left with that last clause, other instruments of credit and securities. And Bitcoin is clearly not a credit or security. And so then you're left with sort of two options, right? You either essentially have the government just buy a security that's linked to Bitcoin, like the ETF or an ETF share or a basket of ETF securities. And that's a fair approach. At least our policy preference, though, was to try to get the government to be able to purchase actual Bitcoin and eventually self-custody it, right? Like that's a policy objective that I think we should aim for. And so while buying an ETF would be an important signal, is it operational issues with like are you privileging one ETF provider over another, and you're still sort of owning this sort of security. You're not really owning Bitcoin, and does that sort of undercut the policy objective of such a strategic Bitcoin reserve? And so then the mechanism that we came up with was essentially, the language is other credit or securities instruments. So you can structure a credit instrument that effectively is dollar denominated, but essentially is redeemed in Bitcoin. And you could have that be like an overnight note. It's a pretty simple contract with a counterparty, in a big exchange, a Bitcoin mining company, whoever. It'd be up to the discretion of the government to make that a competitive process potentially, or however they want to implement it. But it'd be a simple note essentially that says, we'll give you this amount of dollars and we take on a certain amount of credit risk overnight, but the next day we get Bitcoin in return. So I think that's a fair read of the statute, right? People might have different opinions on it, but at least there was no obvious problem with the way that could be structured. And so if the objective is to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve where the government at some point will be able to take self-custody of the actual Bitcoin, if that's your objective, this is, and you want to use existing laws and existing funds, this is the way to do it. And the Exchange Stabilization Fund is about $230 billion total, and about a $38 billion net positive position as at the end of the last annual report, which was FY23. There should be another report coming out soon. So there's about $40 billion essentially of sort of spare change, right, in that fund. And we basically proposed the government within 365 days of the order being signed, 21 billion, a nice sort of mimetic target, to be acquired under this authority and put us into essentially a new program established under the Exchange Stabilization Fund to create this strategic Bitcoin reserve. And then we recognize that the implementation of self-custody may take additional steps, right? Mm-hmm. So you'd want the government to study that, to task the relevant organizations inside the government that are responsible for, say, cryptography and hardware security and software assurance to do their homework, essentially, on establishing the protocols, the mechanisms that would be needed to take full self-custody, to establish it like a digital Fort Knox, right? Physical security, other sorts of security measures. But in the meantime, if you wanted just the government to just buy Bitcoin, there might be a mechanism that you'd want to establish in that executive order to use the existing custody arrangements that are trusted by the government, say, that currently hold U.S. Marshal Service coins, to essentially store those initial purchases. So we were trying to think it through, given these policy objectives, given these existing constraints, what's the most effective and feasible way to go about doing such a thing, and writing up the language and putting it out there, and folks can comment, and we'll see where it goes.
So you think the likelihood is that it will be custodied by someone like Coinbase in the interim, and then hopefully self-custody at some point in the next few years?
Well, I think the current custody provider, and I could be wrong because they might have changed this without much public announcement, but I believe the current custody service provider for the U.S. Marshal Service's Bitcoin holdings is Anchorage Digital.
Okay.
And so, it would be within the government's discretion to essentially, what it basically says is the Treasury Secretary is instructed to evaluate the current custody service provider arrangements, whether those are sufficient operationally from a security perspective. And if they're not sufficient, right, then the Treasury Secretary could issue essentially a new RFP to the market and say, we're interested in custody service services for this holdings, and we put in place these different requirements, and we'll take offers and we'll select. That's sort of what they did for the U.S. Marshal Service's coins. And there might be additional security provisions, there might be additional requirements that the Treasury Secretary may want to impose on like a new contract. That's fine. There are some implementation constraints there. It's like it takes time to develop an RFP in the government and issue that to the market. So it's a trade-off between, if you want to acquire these additional resources quickly and you want them to be securely custodied, using your existing service provider might be like the path of least resistance. But again, that's up to the government to decide. But we want to give different options, and that's certainly an option to do so.
Okay, so you have suggested that the US government get $21 billion worth of Bitcoin. Obviously, Cynthia Lummis's proposal is a lot higher than that. Is that just because of the restrictions in the Exchange Stabilization Fund and just how much money they actually have to go about this?
Yeah, I mean, Congress has power of the purse. The government, the executive can't just, create trillions of dollars, right? And so we want to be responsible and be practical and fit within the authorities and funds available to the executive. And that's basically, maybe there's a little bit more that you could appropriate. I mean, we don't want to, like, that 21 billion, I think, was reasonable given the public information about what essentially is the net position of the exchange stabilization fund. So it wouldn't require selling any existing assets. Wouldn't require selling Japanese yen or euros, which could create other effects. Right? It may be undesirable that you wouldn't want to necessarily cause currency disruptions in those other markets. Again, that's an executive decision, but like there, at least as of the latest report, there essentially is a net positive position that wouldn't encumber any additional assets or cause any other market effects, wouldn't require issuing of any new debt. So it seemed like a pretty straightforward thing. And I think truly it does require, congressional input to make this a strategic level decision for the United States over the long term, right? Like this is going to require potential additional assets be funded, purchases being funded. And that's Congress's mandate there. So, the executive move would be the sort of first move, would be send a strong signal, would meaningfully add to that position, potentially under our version of the order. But, the full scale of such a strategic Bitcoin reserve as envisioned by Lummis would require additional, appropriations, and that would have to come from Congress.
Okay. So if this is to be signed, presumably this is something that Trump could just sign on day one, and that's all that has to happen. It doesn't have to touch Congress in any way.
Yep. That was the binding sort of constraint that we put on ourselves for drafting this particular executive order. Is it such a thing that he could sign on day one, right? In terms of its operational implementation, in terms of its other. We didn't want to put something in there that would be like a poison pill to somebody in the administration, somewhere else in the bureaucracy, where they look at this and they go, oh, that's going to have these other second and third order effects, and it's a problem, or it's going to take us weeks or months to kind of understand or put in place other measures. And so, what is the most effective way of writing such a policy that it could be very, very quickly implemented?
And what is their mandate in terms of selling Bitcoin?
Yeah, so we have a provision in there specifically about that, sort of the provisions for sale. And this is a matter of people's different policy preferences, right? And we felt that, it's important it would be important as part of this for the U.S. government to signal its intent to hold for the long term, right? Of course, operationally, right? Like, there'll be many different presidential elections, right, over the next several years, over the lifetime of the holdings of this, ideally, and future presidents could revoke this executive order, and so its long-term endurance would be subject more to whatever Congress does than whatever the president does. But in signing such an executive order, sending this long-term intent to hold is important, and so we write in essentially a proviso that any sale would have to be approved by the president and would have to be justified by written explanation from the Treasury Secretary that there's some sort of urgent national security crisis that requires the selling of the Bitcoin, right? At the end of the day, it's always an executive. If it's done by executive mandate, it could be undone by executive mandate. And the president at any point could decide to sell, right? There's nothing that's going to stop him. But we wanted to at least send the signal that the government isn't just doing this as like a short-term trade, right? Or is that the government is going to like pump and dump, right? In the 4-year term that Trump is going to hold. That like it's important to send this long-term signal, to hodl what the government decides to acquire. And I think it's, that's an important signal to send.
So if this didn't go through the executive order route and instead went through Congress, would that then be more robust?
Well, they're not either or, right? These are separate branches of government. They have their own mandate and authority. Nothing the president does would obviate anything Congress can do. But certainly, right, like laws are laws. They are the abiding constraints and funding source for whatever the executive branch does. And so this 21 billion, there might be a little bit more or less in the tank of the Exchange Stabilization Fund that potentially could be, added to the SPR as a result of executive action, still within Trump's term. But, it would not be sufficient to meet, like, say, Lummis's objectives. And that would require specific appropriations. or specific actions that the president may or may not have the executive authority to do so. Like in the Lummis bill, it's the sort of this revaluing of the gold certificates, and then using that additional liquidity that is essentially just sort of like as like an accounting trick credited to the Treasury General account from the Fed by revaluing those gold certificates, and then using those new reserves essentially now on the ledger for the United States Treasury General account to go out into the open market and purchase Bitcoin. And so that would require congressional action, and the legal mandate to bind this for future presidents would have to come from Congress. So they're not mutually exclusive by any means, but they're different time frames, right? Like the executive can move quicker, but has constraints. The legislature takes time, and it's no guarantee that this would be a policy priority for the next Congress, and so it may not even happen, right? And so if it's going to get created, the most sort of feasible route and the most sort of short-term route is the executive.
So we're not in the print dollars to buy Bitcoin stage just yet, but are you guys dealing with anyone in the Trump administration at Bitcoin Policy Institute at the moment?
I mean, we provide all of our research publicly, so that's why we want to produce this thing for public awareness, and the folks in the Trump campaign or Trump transition team look at it. I know that paper we might get to is written for the incoming Treasury Secretary, but it's going to be published, right? So he hasn't read it before we release it. Ideally, it would be great to have a meeting with him. I haven't met with him. And if I ever get that chance to meet with him, I will articulate what I've written here, right? So I don't have any secret plan or secret lobbying strategy that's different from what we're putting out in our public documents. And if they want to ask us questions, like we provide research and policy analysis. So this is what we did with the executive order. Is like, hey, Trump had said such a thing, like, how would this be done? Like, let's do some research and let's put out our version of what, would be a feasible way to execute on that policy. But it's really up to them to decide if they want to use it or not.
So on that, internally, like at BPI, what kind of percentage chance are you putting on this getting signed by Trump?
I mean, this is the, I guess, $1 billion question. And you talk to different people will, give you, this isn't happening at all, no chance, to like 100% it's happening, right? So like through the whisper grapevine, right? I've heard both of those. I've heard both the like 100% guaranteed it's going to get signed. And I've heard, is this not a priority? Probably not going to happen. From like apparently credible sources. And it's just like, okay, like, I don't think it's a monolith there. There's a lot of, strong personalities. The Trump team consists of a lot of different individuals. I don't have it's criminology to understand at any given point, right? Like who's in, who's out, who's got the ear, who doesn't have the ear. And the transition time in particular is like a period of intense flux, right? Like where those dynamics of like, who's close to power, like it's like an exponential fall off, right? In any White House of like, the first ring has like, 10 times more power than the second ring does, right? And so it kind of matters a lot whether the information you're getting on such a thing is coming from first ring individuals or second ring individuals. And, people can quickly go from first ring to second ring and back. and that, so this is where people are trying to handicap, right? Like literally, will he sign this piece of paper on day one? That's essentially the dynamic you're trying to model. Yeah. And I just think like nobody knows, right? But I think, putting in place, like, providing essentially a practical, tractable piece of paper that ideally you work out in public to say, this is these are the objections, these are the constraints, makes it more likely to be implemented. And also makes it more likely there isn't like a thing you didn't think of that causes a snafu, right? Like after it gets signed. And then if it screws something up that you weren't aware of, and then he has to like rescind it, well, that would be bad, right? Like you wouldn't want like this sort of technical rug pull to happen because you didn't think of something, or someone in the bureaucracy goes, "Oh, wait a second, like we have an issue here." So yeah, I mean, I would rather it be done right than quickly. I think there's certainly, and but if it gets done day one, that would be, I think, the target to shoot for. But to do that, you want to make sure you do your homework.
Well, it's amazing. Congratulations to all you guys for putting this together. It's very, very cool to see. There's obviously been like quite a lot of debate on Twitter over the last few days since you released it about whether this will sort of strengthen the dollar or it really like signifies lack of trust in the dollar and may end up weakening it. I know you're on the sort of the former side, but do you want to explain that and the dynamics that come with this?
Yeah, and I'd say, I have a caveat to that, right? Which is like, there clearly is a scale of purchase the government could engage in that would be negative for the dollar, specifically like negative for the Treasury market, right? Like, and just to like, as like a thought experiment, right? Like if the government were to announce that it's going to purchase 4 million Bitcoin on day one, right? I think that would likely have negative effects on the Treasury market. Because essentially, it would be the government committing to buying, and I don't think like legally, like there's not enough funds in the tank to do such a thing. But just like hypothetically, it would be like, well, why am I buying the thing the government is not buying, and why would I should buy the thing the government's buying, right? But I think it's a matter of signaling and scale, right? Mm-hmm. As with all things, essentially, there's like a metastable equilibrium, and if you go to the extremes, you can get extreme outcomes. And so I think nothing that we have put forward, I think, is touching any to that sort of danger zone. And prudent policy always tries to calibrate, right, different policy objectives. But I think, they're within a certain regime, and I think that regime is pretty wide. There is a very strong positive reflexivity between Bitcoin and the U.S. dollar system. In particular, right, there's like a direct channel in the sense that Bitcoin and dollar-based stablecoins are quite directly connected, and dollar-based stablecoins are directly connected to the bond market. Mm-hmm. So the more Bitcoin goes up, the more stablecoins have to be issued, essentially, because it's the dominant medium of exchange in currency markets. So to just buy and sell or margin trade, a unit of Bitcoin requires more USDT or USDC when Bitcoin price is higher. And that especially expands the balance sheets of the stablecoin issuers. And the stablecoin issuers are properly reserving those expanded balance sheets. They have to expand their purchases of Treasury bills. And so now there's a net new buyer of Treasury bills in the market. And so just that basic sort of mechanical link is positive for the Treasury market. And then the proliferation of stablecoins themselves as a sort of a dollar, a sort of crypto eurodollar around the world expands the dollar network, mm-hmm. right? And so Bitcoin monetizes more, gets more popular as a store of wealth for some people around the world, and sort of crypto markets take off as a sort of a second derivative function of Bitcoin expanding around the world. That expands the dollar network. So I think this Bitcoin dollar positive synergy is quite strong and quite empirically and sort of theoretically validated. Now, there's some people who think that's a bad thing. Right. Some people who think that like Bitcoin strengthening the dollar system is like strengthening the terrorist state, is strengthening the sort of evil hegemonic imperial system, and that in fact, we want Bitcoin to undermine the dollar, and that's a certain ideological view that some Bitcoiners or some other folks have. At least I don't have that view. I don't think Bitcoin. I don't think BPI has the view that the U.S. government is effectively the world's largest terrorist state. Although they've engaged in, very malign activities. But I think to a certain extent, Bitcoin and dollar-based stablecoins, if they continue along the trajectory they've been moving, help reinforce, what we think of as like traditional American values, right? Like property rights, empowering of the individual relative to potentially oppressive kleptocratic regimes, giving people the ability to transact peer-to-peer without an intermediary, to store their wealth in something that the government can't inflate away or expropriate. And it also kind of ties them in to kind of a digital economic system that ultimately is, a way of growing U.S. soft power influence and counters China's efforts to do their own version of that, right? Export their own vision of techno-authoritarianism that rides on their digital financial rails, mm-hmm. right? So things like the cross-border interbank payment system, mBridge, which is now BRICS-Bridge, their digital currency system, as well as their actual technical infrastructure that they're deploying around the world. So we're in this competition, right? Clearly. And, there are different actors in that competition. I would prefer the Western value system to be provided and the Western digital system to be the one that lays the foundation for the 21st century, and not, essentially a Eurasian power block that has a very different model of relationship between the citizen and the state, a different model of governance in the 21st century. And I would prefer that the ethos of Bitcoin is the one that succeeds. And if at the end of the day, this is about the inevitability of Bitcoin monetizing. States are going to get in the game, right? It maybe happened sooner than most folks were expecting, but like this was part of the trajectory, right? Like if Bitcoin was going to do what it's going to do, states are going to get involved. And the question is then at that point, how do you put in place policies? How do you steer essentially nation state adoption in a way that preserves the core ethos of Bitcoin, that tries to maximize, the political vision that you have for it in its next phase? And so that's, that requires people in open society engaging and articulating a vision for what they want their government to do. And I think just while it is limited, we still live in a participatory democracy, and we should take full advantage of that fact. And we should avail ourselves of all opportunities to say, hey, there's a new administration coming in. Let's change their minds. Yeah. And for me to understand, try to handicap everything Trump might do. But I think it's interesting that like Donald Trump, first administration, was very hostile to Bitcoin, right? Steve Mnuchin was coming after self-hosted wallets, was coming after all sorts of things. It was not clear by any means coming into a potential second Trump administration that the policies would be any different. Right. And, you could go back and rewind the clock and tell this sort of contingent historical story of how Trump, this sort of this opinion shifted, but it did. Right. And I think that's a marker of how, Bitcoin succeeds as a political project and actually changes like how the entire U.S. government apparatus could potentially view it and make it a much more permissive environment for Bitcoin developers, Bitcoin holders to pursue what they believe is the right thing.
I mean, I definitely wasn't expecting this to happen in 2025, but I'm here for it. This sounds great. You said that the stablecoins are going to strengthen the Treasury market, which I understand the dynamic that you're talking about. But are they not buying almost entirely short duration bonds? And what does that do to the sort of long end of the Treasury market?
Yes, for certain. They're buying like 3-month notes essentially. Bills. It doesn't help the 30-year. But to a certain extent, the government has been issuing more on the front end recently. In fact, it's become kind of an issue where what's called like activist or active Treasury issuance was sort of a subtle QE-ish like policy that Yellen put in place.
Can you explain that? Is that because the short duration bonds are more inflationary and they're more money-like than long duration?
Yes. Well, yeah. So the basics is, there's a yield curve. The government issues debt instruments across the yield curve. And the further you go out, the more you're exposed to duration risk, the less money-like that instrument is. The closer it is in terms of its duration, the more money-like it is, right? So like, obviously Federal Reserve notes or reserves at, a bank, those are your IOUs. Those are like redeemable on demand, right? For cash, right? There's no duration associated with those, right? And T-bills, right? Essentially within 3 months are very cash-like, right? So they trade almost as if they're cash-like collateral. And the further you go out, 1, 2 year, 3, 5 year, 10, 30 year, the cash-likeness of that instrument, as a measure of sort of convexity decays. And so, yes, the government, though, when it's borrowing money, is trying to decide how much do they issue across that yield curve. And there's a whole complicated, strategy the government has engaged in over many, many decades to sort of try to, optimize where it issues along the curve. It targets roughly, I think, an average duration of 6 to 7 years has shifted here and there. But they try to keep a balance across the yield curve. And they're very close. They're very sensitive to market conditions, right? Because they're selling this paper into the market. And one major change that's happened in the market for Treasury securities is the role of primary dealers has really become less and less important. It used to be these primary dealers, these major banks would be the sort of the intermediary for the government. Like they would sort of agree to sort of like take that paper at the auctions, and so they would take down a certain percentage of all the new issuance. Increasingly, you're seeing more and more Treasury securities being intermediated by non-primary dealers. And it's particularly hedge funds in the secondary market for Treasury securities have become like the marginal like new balance sheet that's expanded. People that want to essentially do this called, I don't want to be too dumb, but like sort of a relative value trade, essentially.
Is that with interest rates going up, or is that something different?
That's just where they're buying the spot and they're shorting the future,
Okay.
and they're sort of trying to capture this little arbitrage. It gets a bit technical in the sort of treasury market plumbing, but the activist treasury issuance was sort of the term that some economists, actually was Rubini and a guy named Stephen Moran, who was a former senior advisor in the Trump Treasury Department. We're doing this analysis through like a long paper, detailing the mechanism and quantifying its effect. Essentially, the bottom line is the government had to issue a lot of debt in the last few years, right? We're just, as people have looked at the chart, just like hockey sticking up. And as the Fed has increased interest rates, right, that has made the interest burden go up. And we've gotten to this point now where we're essentially spending more on interest than we are in the Department of Defense, which isn't great from a strategic perspective, but just parking that aside, we're having to issue a lot of debt. And the government apparently was concerned that if they were to issue, more of that debt at the long end, that there may not be sufficient buyers, or that the clearing price for that debt would require interest rates to go up. And the government didn't want interest rates to go up, because if long end interest rates go up, guess what? 30-year mortgages go up. And guess what? The median voter in Pennsylvania that is trying to buy, their first house, or is sort of, stuck in their first house and they haven't been able to level up because they got a low interest rate, is now looking at mortgages at 7-8%. And it's not great. And so there was a strong pressure. And also the government borrows, right, at those longer end. They like to try to borrow as much as they can, but they're paying a high interest rate for it. It's going to be very expensive. And it locks that rate in for 10, 20, 30 years. So you're kind of like, it's not ideal to do that. And so the government essentially shifted more of its issuance to the short end and started issuing a lot more short duration paper. And because it's more cash-like, there's a lot more demand on the front end, right? So you don't get the interest rate volatility that you get if you try to smush it all out on the long end. And because you're issuing a lot at the short end, you're essentially, you're sort of artificially reducing what otherwise would be the market rate for the long end bonds if you were behaving normally. And they quantified that effect at, I think I'm forgetting the exact, but roughly 50 basis points. It could be, wrong on the exact number, but it was a material amount, equivalent to, 2 rate hikes or so, or whatever. So back to stablecoins. Stablecoins are at the short end. There are some, plumbing issues associated with, potentially having so much extra demand on the short end. But at the end of the day, it's a buyer of U.S. debt. And importantly, like most stablecoins issuers don't like provide a yield themselves, right? And so the government is effectively, it's sort of like a form of financial repression that the government is able to impose on the crypto market. Especially because this will circulate around the world. These dollar claim holders don't own like a reserve account at a correspondent bank where they get paid a yield. There's all sorts of technical tweaks that maybe the government could put in place. There's a lot of attention on a market structure and a stablecoin bill that would try to, reshore some of the stablecoin issuers, because right now it's all in the offshore market. But if you could reshore the issuance, you could, essentially, can create like essentially a private sector digital dollar that proliferates around the world. Again, some people don't like that. Some people don't want the dollar to get strengthened. That's a policy perspective. I think the U.S. government will have that will have the view that the dollar system should remain strong, and it's very clear that President Trump wants the dollar to remain strong. And so, just as a matter of like strategic alignment, it is the case, and it's a good thing to emphasize to the extent that Bitcoin and dollar-based stablecoins reinforce the strength of the dollar network and demand for treasury assets.
When we were in Nashville on What Bitcoin Did V1, we had Preston Pish and Luke Groman on the show, and they were talking, Preston specifically was talking about the idea of putting Bitcoin on the long duration bonds as a way of incentivizing people to go further out on that yield curve. Do you think that's a realistic outcome that may happen?
I mean, we're thinking in terms of like, if then, right? Like, if the government were to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve, then they have Bitcoin holdings, material Bitcoin holdings. If they decide to expand those Bitcoin holdings and adopt a much broader pro-Bitcoin strategy, what could be the elements of that pro-Bitcoin strategy? I think it's curious to explore. I wouldn't say it's like, the immediate thing that's likely to happen, but you could imagine this sort of building to a point where there could be interesting novel financial instruments that the U.S. government could develop and deploy that would provide, essentially like doing sort of what Michael Saylor is doing for certain sort of trapped pools of capital that otherwise can't or won't buy Bitcoin. It's sort of, he's like shaving off some of the volatility of Bitcoin by kind of like running the raw Bitcoin through his sort of financial balance sheet and then creating a bunch of different financial instruments. On the high end, he's got his stock and he's got the ETF that is double leverage his stock, which is itself, a leverage play on Bitcoin. And then you have, these convertible debt instruments, and you have corporate bonds that, provide some of the upside, some of the volatility upside of Bitcoin. But, it's been sort of stepped down, right? And so the government could essentially do something very similar and issue essentially treasury bonds that have like a Bitcoin kicker, right? So it takes some of the upside and sort of graft it on to the payoff profile of a traditional sort of treasury note. I think operationally that would take a lot of work to figure out how that could be structured, the mechanics of designing such a note. But in principle, nothing about it is implausible to me or nonsensical. Like, it's a very sensible sort of financial instrument to construct. I think it's more of a political question of how the government would want to signal this, right, to the market, right? Because you can imagine a scenario where it becomes so successful that, like, just like with MicroStrategy, you can't feed the ducks anymore, and then it could create a problem on the rest of the market, which is like, well, I don't want the normal treasury bond. I want the treasury bond with the Bitcoin kicker, right? So this is where I think it is important, and I recognize, the concerns, but some people might have is it's a slippery slope, right? If the government is like, all of a sudden gets into Bitcoin, that could be like, okay, at a certain point, does it start to undermine the credibility of these other instruments? I think it's a matter of forward guidance, it's a matter of prudent policy, it's a matter of calibration, it's a matter of timing and implementation, where you can get the best of both worlds. But I would not recommend just kind of like, YOLOing or just sort of throwing a bunch of things out there because, you want to like go all in. From my perspective, I wouldn't recommend that. I don't think the U.S. government will do that. But yeah, this idea of a Bitcoin bond is an interesting idea. It's worth exploring, doing the research on. And the government has issued novel. It's tested out 20-year stuff. Even the TIPS product was relatively new.
Is that the inflation adjusted bond?
Yeah, exactly. So maybe you could do something similar, which is like a BITS, like a Bitcoin indexed treasury security. I don't know. Like, it's worth brainstorming. Folks that are experts in sort of treasury market infrastructure and the bond market, and you'd want to do lots of analysis and market research. Consider the second and third order effects, but it's worth exploring.
What Bitcoin Did is brought to you by our lead sponsor and massive legends, Iron, the largest NASDAQ-listed Bitcoin miner using 100% renewable energy. Iron are not just powering the Bitcoin network, they're also providing cutting-edge computing resources for AI, all backed by renewable energy. We've been working with their founders, Dan and Will, for quite some time now and have been really impressed with their values, especially their commitment to local communities and sustainable computing power. So whether you're interested in mining Bitcoin or harnessing AI compute, Iron is setting the standard. Visit iron.com to learn more, which is IREN.com. This is going to get wild. All right, we should talk about Scott Bessent. I was talking to you a little bit privately when Trump was looking at who he should bring in as his Treasury Secretary, and you were quite excited about Scott Bessent. Do you want to give a bit of background on him and explain why?
I mean, he is... he's like a markets guy for one, right? So he's a hedge fund guy. He's, been trained under the tutelage of first Soros, but really Druckenmiller, who everyone recognizes as kind of like, a living legend, understands both like financial market plumbing as well as for these big macro geopolitical things. And so he's had a front row seat to, what really goes on, right, in the global financial system, and what really what are the no kidding like power structures at play, capital flows, major shot callers. So he understands the lay of the land. He understands how the game is played, right? And he's respected by folks around the world for that knowledge and for that sort of operational market acumen. And so that's just, it's good to have somebody who like knows what they're talking about and like brings practical experience to the job. Isn't like a PhD economist who spends most of their life, writing papers and going to sort of think tanks meetings. Is like, he's a markets guy. He's like, he knows how the real world works, which is important. And I think he's coming in with pretty broad ambitions for sort of what he called a global economic reordering. Right. And it is going to obviously take a number of potential different forms, and no plan survives first contact with reality. Right. But I think it's important to understand, like, what is at least is the outlines of such a grand, economic reordering, and like monetary reset is even the term that has been thrown around. Like, what would that entail? Right. And to what extent does it align with like what Trump's sort of economic and geopolitical vision would result in. And I think so I've done a lot to kind of try to research what I think Bessent is coming in to do, or what the contours of his plan are, and what sort of geopolitical and macroeconomic and monetary landscape is he facing, right? What are those constraints? And so, I wrote this paper, hopefully, be released pretty soon after this recording goes live, that tries to at least replay my understanding of, well, what is that external environment? What are these sort of structural fragilities and imbalances in the legacy system that the next administration is going to have to manage? What are the apparent, strategies that Bessent's team may be looking to deploy to, reset the terms of the global economic and trading and financial system, and then to articulate a view of how I think Bitcoin aligns with that larger geoeconomic play, right? That's kind of I'm trying to like, okay, replay back. I think this is how I see the world and the constraints and challenges that you're going to face. Hopefully those resonate with how you see the world. The second is, okay, well then here's how I think you may go about doing it, right? Like, I don't think Bessent's coming in there with like Bitcoin as like the primary tool. And nor should I think it be the, one weird trick that's going to fix the whole global economic system or compete with China, et cetera. But so like, okay, here's how I think you're thinking about the different tools of statecraft that you're looking to deploy. And then frame, here's where I think Bitcoin fits in, right? So like, as part of your larger play, you're the quarterback or you're the coach on the sidelines drawing up all these different plays in your book. Like, let's put the Bitcoin play in the book, right? And understand how it fits in, right? And I don't think that had been done, right? I think the Bitcoin thing it's on its own track. It's like, yep, Bitcoin's good for America. We should do something that's like pro-Bitcoin, but it's kind of its own lane, right? And I think it's important for the U.S. government to think about a holistic geoeconomic and monetary, essentially strategy, you leveraging all the different tools of statecraft. And I think Bitcoin is now potentially, a useful tool in that regard. So that's how I wrote that report. Again, it's just my take. Yeah.
And what are the threats that you think he sees here? Is the big one China threatening sort of US dominance?
That is one of the big ones. I think there's lots of things that are in the mix.
Okay, let's go through them.
Yeah, because obviously the China. I titled the paper essentially a global economic reordering, U.S.-China competition, and Bitcoin as a tool of U.S. statecraft. And so I put U.S.-China competition in the title because it is like, I think, the defining geoeconomic and geopolitical relationship in the world system. And so like a lot of other things are sort of downstream of that relationship. And so it's important to sort of, put that in the front. But there's lots of other things also happening in the world. So I don't like just make it like a China thing, right? And there's sort of a paradox associated with the China challenge, right? Which is they're on the one hand, they rapidly have become a peer competitor to us on all these other dimensions, on all these critical dimensions of national power, right? So there's the scale of the military build up, their technological build up in the military domain, but also their broader technological ecosystem that they've been able to develop, essentially indigenous state national champions, and then deploy those technologies around the world and start eating market share higher up the value chain and become not just the sort of industrial low-cost producer for the world, but also like high-end, high-value manufacturing, electric vehicles, 5G, subsea cables, satellites, new energy systems. Like they're coming for the full gamut of next-generation technological domains that are going to become like the next industrial paradigm, right? So there's a major strategic challenge to U.S. economic and technological and military dominance from China. So that's on the one hand.
And is that the reason that the US can't just continue doing what it always has and it now has to make a change?
Yes, I think, yeah. If you're like the bottom line up front is like what our basic strategy for the last 30, 40 years, beat the Soviets and then sort of dominate the global system and try to, sort of cement the the Western rules-based liberal international order and the sort of geoeconomic system that we were on top of. That's been our play for 30, 40 years, essentially. And, it's starting to lose its juice. And certain aspects of that system are now sort of being turned against us. And so there's a need to kind of, again, like reset the terms of the global geoeconomic system. And yeah, I think that's sort of motivating us, is like what has been working isn't working anymore. We need to do something different, basically. But the China challenge is again, it's a paradox, because China, at the same time that they are a true strategic pacing threat to the U.S. on these different, say, military or technological or sort of industrial dimensions, they also are a potential a risk because of how fragile their economy is, right? They have this sort of paradox, right? Like they're a state-run system, and they're experiencing essentially debt deflation at the moment. And they have potentially the balance sheet to absorb or try to, inject liquidity to try to stave off that. But there is a risk scenario where China hits an air pocket in their economy, and there's a risk of a sort of a debt deflationary wave that gets exported to the world, like they do a shock devaluation of the yuan, and that triggers a whole bunch of these other second and third order disruptions to the monetary system, to our financial markets, et cetera.
Just from like a layman's perspective, can you explain why that is a massive negative? So
like you've seen this example, like the Japanese yen over the summer, right? When it had that like collapse, that triggered an unwind of all these carry trades, and the stock market fell like 10% in a day, right? So just in general, right, the global financial system, especially these offshore sort of Eurodollar markets, are very highly leveraged. And when any major economy like does anything really like dramatic, especially in their currencies, those can have like a whole bunch of like cascading effects that just start breaking things, right? And so you can get a financial crisis, right, be triggered just because of this domino that starts falling through, triggers deleveraging, triggers fire sales of assets, and then forces a whole bunch of like emergency interventions. And ideally, you want to avoid that, right? That was the Japanese yen. The Chinese economy is much larger, and our systems, despite it's a paradox, because unlike with the Soviet system during the Cold War, we had some integration financially, but it was pretty thin. These systems were much more like semi-autarkic blocks. And there's lots of commodity trade, et cetera, but like the financial capital flows were really, really restricted between these two competing geopolitical blocks in the Cold War. Now we have this geopolitical competition taking place while our systems are like Siamese twins, right? And so this is essentially the paradox that Essence is trying to manage, which is how do you fight and win a competition with an adversary like China while sort of also creating like agreements, ideally like accords with your adversary that are in your mutual interest to preserve financial stability, right? Because nobody wins if there's a global financial crisis because, that de-risking gets out of hand, or there's a flashpoint military confrontation over Taiwan or the South China Sea. Those would destroy, the global trading system or severely damage it, would be crippling for China's economy, crippling for our economy, be a no-win situation, right? So how do you negotiate essentially a new agreement, right? At the end of the day, I think what we're heading towards is some sort of new Bretton Woods style agreement, right? But between now and then, you have to, improve your bargaining position, right? You got to threaten, you got to bring as many of your allies to your side of the fence as possible. You got to wield all these different carrots and sticks to try to improve your bargaining power, undermine your adversary's position. And then ideally, when you think the moment is right, politically, geopolitically, you try to negotiate a new settlement, right? A new agreement. Trade agreements, currency agreements, maybe even diplomatic military treaties. Again, like the vision is very high, like the ambitions are very high, right? There's a lot that requires a lot to put all together to make it work. But I think we're heading into a period of history where there's a recognition that all of these things, like the geopolitical competition, the technological competition, the financial, integrations and instabilities and fragilities in global trade, and the imbalance in global trade is not sustainable, especially from the U.S.'s perspective, and even from the Chinese perspective. They recognize that the playbook they've been running can only go so far. They can only try to steal so much manufacturing capacity from the West, and essentially run this mercantilist playbook. Just keep juicing their exports, and they're facing a lot of economic and political issues internally as well. Right? There's been reports of these domestic incidents rising. You've had people, massive youth unemployment. A lot of grievances at the local level that there's unfortunately there's these incidents of people driving cars into crowds or stabbing school children. This has started to increase, and that starts saying,
I've not even seen that.
It's sending concerns up the sort of party apparatus of discontent, right, at the local level, and their economy has really never recovered from COVID. So there's a lot potentially on the table to sort of do this global economic reordering, right? But it's a non-trivial task to sort of get all those pieces in place. And yeah, so I just think Bitcoin, I try to write the piece to sort of put Bitcoin in the mix of okay, here's how, again, it's not gonna be the one weird trick, but there's different visions of how the system could be reconfigured. China has been trying to, put in place the different mechanisms, the different geopolitical, geoeconomic, and technological platforms and relationships and systems in place, so that they have an alternative, right? It's not going to replace SWIFT or the cross-border or chips of the clearing system in New York, but it's like a failover network that they're trying to construct with, say, Brixbridge, Mbridge, SIPs. It's not as efficient, it's not as large scale, but it could work. It is working as a backup, right? Most of the Middle Eastern banks and Asian banks and central banks are essentially connected in this alternative monetary network to China. And so, yeah, this is the new game, kind of digital great game playing out.
So is the challenge here really for Becent to come in and try and bring China in line, say, you're okay doing your thing, but you're still the little brother in this negotiation?
I mean, I don't know what sort of terms or relative status. I mean, if I read the tea leaves of some of the people that they're bringing in on the economic statecraft and kind of China competition side, there's a view that, in fact, China potentially has a structural advantage over the U.S. They would never admit that publicly, but there's a sense of if push came to shove and we got into a war, obviously global economic system is in the tank, but you're in a war, you got to win, right? That's the game. It's not about marginal GDP growth. It's you got to man up and get ships in the water, planes in the sky with missiles. You got to get your troops, you got to get your allies, you got to fight in space. You got to get it done, and that requires fundamentally requires material. It requires industrial capacity. It requires supply chains. It requires workforce to produce those things. It requires the political will and energy to rewire your economic system to fight and win a war, take losses. I'm not saying we're going towards war, but that's the job of the military, is to plan to fight and win a war. That's their whole point. So they got to look in the mirror objectively and be if we had to fight and win a war against China, like what would be our chances? And they've done the studies, they've done the war games, and it's not great. And a lot of it comes down to our industrial base not being up to the task, right? Looking at a number of different scenarios that are very plausible where you get into sort of a fight, right? It's not nuclear, but conventional naval fight over Taiwan or in the South China Sea. And there's a initial engagement, a week or two with whatever assets each side has in theater, and they just sort of throw it at each other. And if that's not decisive, then it's kind of like everyone has to reset, recharge, and then redeploy a second wave. And then the question is, who's got the industrial capacity at scale to create another 200 ships, to create another 1,000 missiles, or 500,000 drones? And it's very obvious it's not us. That is clearly China's strategic advantage.
Yeah.
So unless we win that initial decisive confrontation with whatever technical super whiz bang stuff we've got tucked away, that's a high risk, because if we don't, really decisively win that initial engagement, that industrial capacity to recharge for a second wave is not going to happen, right? China's going to roll over. And so that's been now like the acute, like strategic vulnerability that has now become front of mind to folks like Besant, but all these other defense analysts that realize just how poorly suited or poorly situated the U.S. government is for military confrontation with China in that respect. So that's motivating, like one of the motivations behind resetting the global economic system, right? Like the current architecture is we issue scarce equities and treasury securities to the world, and we buy their finished products essentially to power our consumer economy. But they get our manufacturing base in return, right? So that's been a good trade for Wall Street. It's been a good trade for finance more broadly. It's been a good trade for political elites that in sort of a corrupt relationship with our financial system have engineered our entire economy to absorb foreign surpluses into our scarce assets and take a cut, right? So our political markets, our financial markets have become essentially the money laundering mechanisms to get to systematically absorb foreign surpluses from OPEC Plus and China. And now we're waking up to the strategic effects, the pathologies that has created in our political system and our social system, right? It's generally a lot of wealth inequality, the atrophy of not just the defense industrial base, but manufacturing more broadly. That's kind of been Trump's whole mantra, right? Along with other, and it triggers Trumpism, it triggers sort of nativism, it triggers all these other political effects. And I think you're seeing this is not working, right? It's not going to be sustainable.
This episode is brought to you by River. There are many places to buy Bitcoin, but there's no exchange like River. They have innovative products, phone support, and a dedication to security that I haven't seen anywhere else. With River, buying Bitcoin is easy. You can set up zero-fee recurring buys to automatically build your stack, and while you're waiting for the perfect buying opportunity, River even lets you earn daily Bitcoin interest on your cash balance, which outperforms most high-yield savings accounts. Your Bitcoin is stored safely in multi-sig cold storage, plus you have peace of mind knowing that River has monthly proof of reserves and holds all client Bitcoin that wasn't withdrawn to self-custody. Open an account for yourself or your business at river.com/WBD. That's river.com/WBD. So where does Bitcoin fit into all of this?
Yes. So I think this is where Bitcoin has some interesting properties, both as a emerging novel global reserve asset, as well as a global digital financial network, right? And so if there are challenges, but also opportunities, in the world system that are on both of those fronts, right? We have a challenge when it comes to the both stability of the present global reserve asset, which is the Treasury security market. And it's the sort of pathologies that having to keep that market stable and growing has on our domestic economy and our military capacity, right? Because we have to just be the reserve currency issuer, reserve asset issuer, effectively equity issuer to the world. That has had a number of these strategic effects, right, on our industrial base that we were talking about. And then there's also this digital payments network system competition playing out, right? That China's trying to rewire the world kind of in its image and in its geopolitical kind of network. I think Bitcoin plays in both of those competitions in a way that favors the United States, right? So, as we talked about earlier, Bitcoin dollar-based stablecoins provided, essentially a net new issuer for or demand for that issuance of Treasury market debt, as well as help expand kind of a dollar-based payments network around the world. And so, to the extent the United States could sort of put in place policies that would reinforce the adoption of Bitcoin, the dollar-based stablecoins, it would sort of tip that geopolitical and network competition back in our favor, right? And I don't think it's like the one weird trick that will solve all these different problems, right? The reason why you might use tariffs for certain things, you might use export controls for certain things. I think it should be a part of that suite of tools that you can reinforce as a way of securing our national and geopolitical advantage over the long term. And I think it's just important to start. Again, I have that idea. There might be other ideas, especially along the way, where you can think about now you have this other tool in your toolkit, and as you get into these different negotiations, or you get into these different potential points of challenge, have this thing that you can use to your advantage, right? So that's basically what I'm not actually being super dramatic, right? I'm just saying this is a thing. It's a good thing for us. We should think about how to maximize its advantage, especially if you're going to do all these other potentially dramatic shifts in the global system. There might be downside risks that those other things might result in, and maybe Bitcoin would help defray some of those risks, right? So in particular, right, one scenario, and again, this is just thinking in terms of scenarios, but I've seen, right, Zoltan Pozsar, for example, has written about what a Besant kind of Bretton Woods style shift would entail. And in his imagining, it's like a gilded Bretton Woods 2, which essentially wields like geopolitical carrots and sticks to impose like essentially financial repression on the rest of the world, or friends and allies as well, to kind of geopolitically control the long end of the yield curve. And the mechanisms that could involve would be like forced swaps, right? In particular, say forced swap, like kind of a geopolitically coerced swap of say short-term bills or treasury notes for like longer dated instruments, say 50 or even 100-year bonds. And those might even be like non-marketable debt instruments where that, country, say, could be Japan or South Korea or Taiwan or Gulf countries, maybe even Europe, although they don't have much spare change, essentially agree to swap their short-term holdings for longer-term bonds where they can't sell them easily. They can only repo them at the Fed, essentially at par. And that effectively solves this kind of problem the government has. The reason why they were doing active treasury issuance in the first place is because they were scared to issue too much on the long end. Well, here, essentially forcing, non-marketable buyers or buyers of non-marketable debt at the long end. So it helps you, expand the duration of your yield curve, and maybe even locks in.
Can I ask you a question on that?
Yeah, jump in.
Does that not completely disincentivize these nations from then buying further treasuries?
Depends, right? I think this is a high-risk maneuver. One interpretation of the strategy is that it locks them in to the U.S. geoeconomic orbit, right? It forces them to choose, right, a side, essentially. And it would essentially involve creating you can imagine doing it in concert with other things. So there's like the currency reserve asset play. There's a tariff threat on top of that, which is, if you don't do this deal, right, we'll also slap tariffs on you. And maybe you add a third piece, which is essentially export controls or restrictions on accessing our advanced technology, say AI or other breakthrough capabilities that could be coming online. And essentially this sort of tech, tariff, and currency club, right, is saying we're going to create this club. We are the core of the club. We admit or expel members from the club. You want to be part of this club, you got to pay an entrance fee and maybe an annual, membership fee, essentially, to that security zone that accesses our markets, gets privileged access to our advanced technology. But if you want to be a member of that club, you got to pay. And, this is one form of payment, essentially, this sort of, reserve asset swap. May even involve gold, right? In some cases, like, hey, give us your gold and we'll give you 50-year bonds, right? And then the government takes that gold and then, in Zoltan's view, like, could revalue the gold. And then now you've got, very similar to Lummis's plan, you revalue the gold, maybe even above market value. And then you've essentially can create hundreds of billions, maybe even $1 trillion+ of liquidity, like in the Treasury General account, that the secretary could deploy for, say, strategic domestic energy investment or critical technology build out, semiconductor fabs, et cetera, right? Essentially saying to the world, we are going to be the core provider of these public goods and private goods, global public security, the security zone, our military enforcing, trade around the world, and also, private goods in terms of our breakthrough AI and other technologies. And you, the rest of the world, if you want to benefit from that, you're gonna have to subsidize it, right? You're gonna have to give us some of your gold, and you're gonna have to do this set of swaps. And then if you're gonna do that, essentially it's like geopolitically induced yield curve control, financial repression on the periphery of the imperial dollar system. It's high risk because there might be members of that club that are now kind of like trying to play both sides, right? And say the Gulf or in Asia. And they may call the bluff, right? They may not join, or they may decide, hey, you know what? I can get a better deal from China. China's going to give me similar AI tech. And I don't actually think your security guarantees are all that credible. And by the way, like, this threat of tariffs doesn't matter because, I got markets that I can create for myself and for my goods, right? So it requires a lot of very adroit statecraft and very country specific negotiations to sort of put in place a term of an arrangement with that particular country that, forces the issue, like forces them to pick a side. Then you lock them in, by making the swap happen, and then they're already committed to it, right? They've already made the deal, right? So it's going to be very costly for them to undo the deal. So that seems to be, a potential play coming in, right? And interesting thing about Bitcoin in that respect, which is, okay, that's a high risk play, right? A lot of geopolitical yield curve control, right? It effectively will require capital controls, right, in that club. It's gonna be very costly. It's gonna have, it's gonna require other measures to patch up things on the margin that start getting squirrely, right, when you do something like this. And you could see assets like Bitcoin and gold would benefit from that, right? Like, that is a scenario where essentially the government is, laying down the line, and it will likely come in with other liquidity measures, right? Like, the Fed is probably not going to remain entirely neutral in this type of strategy, right? Because if there is marginal selling of Treasury securities, if there is this liquidity provision that has to be provided to those friends and allies to make the system look good, Bitcoin and gold are going to benefit, right? This is like Russell Napier's thesis, right? Sort of thing. And if that's the case, you're going to do this play that's going to potentially, any financial repression, any capital controls, any yield curve control is going to lead to a run towards scarce assets. And Bitcoin has historically shown itself to be the most sensitive, liquidity barometer, right? Like Luke Roman, it's the one last functioning sort of smoke alarm in the global system. And so it will likely go up. The question, though, is is the U.S. government in a position to benefit from that effect, right? In fact, if it's going to do this sorts of, like BTFB at scale, like geopolitical BTFB, right? Like all these banks that had this sort of treasury net or a treasury gross loss, right? That was all of a sudden like a banking panic, and the government had to essentially guarantee that debt at par. That was de facto liquidity injection, right? So if we're going to be doing this sort of thing at scale, at a larger scale, Bitcoin's going to go up, right? And they could, if they own Bitcoin, then it's kind of like they win as a result, right? Whereas if it's, say, the Saudis or the Qataris or the Emiratis or, God forbid, the Chinese that hold a marginal Bitcoin position, then we don't get to benefit from that result of our geopolitical actions, right? So it's okay. Bitcoin essentially is a shock absorber of those sorts of global liquidity developments. I mean, we've seen this with Bitcoin's response to the SVB failures as well as the Russia-Ukraine invasion. Bitcoin's immediate move in the few weeks after that, showed it essentially as a positive response to those types of banking and geopolitical shocks. So putting Bitcoin on your balance sheet, right, essentially engineers a positive relationship between any geopolitical or banking shock that you may trigger or that an adversary may trigger in response to one of your moves. But you've already built in kind of a structural hedge, right? And you sort of win either way, right? And if, the old standby gold wins, well, you already have a lot of gold on your balance sheet, but also a lot of our adversaries have a lot of gold on their balance sheets. And they've been scrambling to acquire more gold. China, Russia, Iran, even India. And so if Zolan called it a gilded Bretton Woods too, which sort of re-anchors the global monetary system and kind of almost does what like Bitcoin has been talking about with kind of like trying to graft the stability and global reserve asset of gold to the Treasury market and use American geopolitical power to kind of fuse those two things so that American fiscal position and our geopolitical position hedged on Treasury securities benefits from, a re-anchored global monetary system around gold. Gold bugs, of course, would love that. I just think, okay, you can basically do that exact same play, but with Bitcoin as well, right? Maybe not at the, you could,
and then you have first mover advantage or early mover advantage with Bitcoin as well.
Yeah. And there's an extreme version where you do it with Bitcoin instead of gold. And that's almost like the Saylor, thesis. It's like, just sell all the gold, rug pull Eurasia, right? That's been acquiring gold and then go all in a Bitcoin. There's something to be said for that. It's like, it's a marker that's sort of like at the end of the spectrum. It seems to be hard pressed to convince, the Trump administration to go that far. But I think there's variations much further in between that are kind of best of both worlds, where there isn't as much of this sort of 0 to 1, Bitcoin Bretton Woods, but it is a Bitcoin / gilded Bretton Woods system evolution. Sometimes it might be certain parts of it that are done as like a surprise shock, like the 1970s stuff with Nixon. But I think there are also parts of it that will be negotiated settlements, like a negotiated accord to manage fluctuations in, say, currency markets that nobody wants to get out of control. And so this is where I think Bitcoin's now reached the point. It's not quite gold. Right. So I spend a lot of time in the paper at the end being like, okay, gold is a $20 trillion asset. Bitcoin's a $2 trillion asset. If you're going to make that play right now, just like those are the relative proportions that you got to work with. Right. And so if Bitcoin were to monetize relatively more than gold, then if we hold more Bitcoin than most of our adversaries, then we stand to gain in this sort of global economic reordering. But then any prudent strategic planner has to consider different scenarios over like the longer term, right? So there's like a short-term window. What is Besant going to try to put in place? What are these, big moves of the next 6, 9, 18 months? But then what is this longer term, system? Like what is it potentially going to evolve to? And if Bitcoin is part of that initial play, what would that look like as like a future trajectory, right? Like then you're potentially then have to realistically consider future scenarios, not too far out, 5, 10, 15 years, where Bitcoin is monetizing to close to parity with gold. You could imagine a scenario like that. I put in sort of 3 scenarios. It's like reaches, some meaningful fraction of gold, say half of gold. And it's a global monetary asset. It's not replacing gold, but it's becoming a serious part of portfolios, including at the nation state level. And maybe it stops there. But then you consider a second scenario, which is, okay, it reaches parity with gold, right? Which would now be a dramatic, much more significant shift in the balance sheets of large portfolios, and where Bitcoin is seen essentially as like a digital gold reserve asset, right? And that's, maybe a 10x from here, right? 10, 20x from here, depending on what gold does, right? And then there's a third scenario, right? This would be, not the sort of hyper bullish, scenarios some people put out, but like, okay, it reaches maybe half of the current global bond market, maybe $30 trillion in total market, somewhere around there, right? Again, these are kind of just like moon math, but where it's essentially now diversified into a lot of these. It's eating from stocks, it's eating from some real estate equities. It's now like the dominant global reserve asset. And, if the U.S. is going to essentially start this trajectory in a very incipient stage, I think it's prudent now to start thinking through different scenarios over the longer term, right? And then consider the primary and secondary effects that you could sketch out for a world system where Bitcoin is at these different levels of monetization. And then, and I don't do this in the paper because it's already 40 some pages long, but then like the next real analytical task for the government and outside researchers is to think about what's the ideal path between here and there, right? Because you could get to a point where Bitcoin is monetized to say reach parity with gold. And that could happen, I would say, you could put it in like a 2x2, right? Of just, if you're just analyzing that scenario, there's it happens. It's almost like AI timelines. It's like a short time. It's like a short takeoff, right? Or a long takeoff, right? Either happens like in a step function, or it happens in kind of like a linear growth, right? Or some sort of smoothed out exponential. And then the other part of the axis is U.S. holds more Bitcoin, or non-U.S. maybe rivals hold more Bitcoin. Right. And so you want to consider what's the ideal box to be in? I think the ideal box is US holds more Bitcoin and it's like a slow takeoff. Right. Because then it gives time for the whole system to evolve. It gives time for Bitcoin to sort of mature in all these different institutional and existing systems. And, when things are when a very highly leveraged system undergoes a change quickly, things break. And, that can have negative positive, a net negative result, right? Because you just, it takes a lot more effort to build something than to break it. So then if I just have that 2x2 matrix of if Bitcoin, in the scenario where Bitcoin is monetizing to say reach parity with gold or more, the ideal scenario is US holds most of it and it goes slowly, right? That might not be the most practical scenario, right? It might practically mean it has to happen fast, right? And if it has to happen fast, then you want to make sure that it's the U.S. that holds the most and not our adversaries. Because the worst scenario is a fast monetization where non-U.S. rivals hold the most Bitcoin. That's the worst part of the quadrant, right? And so you need to put in place strategies that ideally steer the trajectory towards, the bottom right, if it's U.S. and slow takeoff, while also mitigating the top left, meaning fast takeoff non-U.S. holders, right? And that requires lots of policies. It requires forethought, right? If you just do it by accident, if you just do it, without thinking through second, third order effects, then you may get adversaries get the jump on you, and then leverage, their maybe more authoritarian systems to do things quicker. We are democracy. We have to do things in a participatory and deliberative fashion, right? So I think, that's sort of my take, right? This is why you need to have this conversation start. This is why, when I think about strategic Bitcoin reserve, it's sort of the step one, right? But you need to think about what step 2, 3, 4, 5 look like, and think about it with these different scenarios in mind, and have this be part of our strategic planning. Have this be part of our approach to statecraft, and that's essentially my pitch to this end.
And you talk a lot about the sort of game theory in this, and the threat that other nation states do get the jump on the US. And in the paper, you specifically mention the Gulf states. And now I've heard rumors that some of these Gulf states may have already 300,000 Bitcoin. We don't know exactly. I don't know if that's true. But do you think that's going to force the US's hand to make a move quite quickly?
I heard similar. Again, I don't have primary evidence of their wallet address, but yeah, I think there's a reason why the Emirates hosted Bitcoin Mina. There's a reason why senior government officials were there. Is they have a strong interest in this, not just Bitcoin mining, but seems most likely have a material position, right? People have thrown out all sorts of numbers, right? Who knows? But that is it's not a trivial amount, right? Whatever the number is, right? Whether it's 200, 300, 400,000, that potentially is more than the US, right? Which would be if I was Trump or Trump's family, if I heard that, I'd be well, that's unacceptable. Okay, these long run things is a different question, but of course, America has to have the most Bitcoin. We're the most powerful country. This is an important global asset. It's absurd if we don't have our own. I think that's kind of they're not really thinking it through the way that I was just analyzing a year, for the last hour and a half, right? It's just basic, okay, of course, America's got to be number one. We're number one in everything. This is something we should be number one in, right? It's that's it, right? And there's an argument to be made that like, well, we already are number one if you count, our companies, our Bitcoin mining hash rate, individual holders of Bitcoin. And you could make an argument that like, well, that's what you need to be number one in. You don't need to be number one in like official government holdings. But if this play is going to occur, or if there are going to be potential dramatic shakeups in the global economic monetary system where the U.S. is potentially in a position of vulnerability for, then it's very prudent for the U.S. to have a material, if not the dominant position in, or the largest position in Bitcoin. So yeah, I think that nation state FOMO, well, it's kind of a meme. Like human beings are human beings at a fractal level, right? Like the same sort of psychological dynamics that play out between humans also play out between national leadership, right? But I don't know. My observations coming back from Bitcoin Mina gave me a slightly different perspective on this idea of game theory or Bitcoin arms race, which I know has kind of been memed because it's still a diplomatic set of relationships. The global economic system is still very tightly integrated, and many countries still view the U.S. as like the most powerful country, right? And so if you're a middle-sized Gulf state, you have to kind of think about, right? Like you don't want to piss the Americans off. You don't want to insult them by announcing a dramatically larger Bitcoin position, saying we're going to keep building more. We're going to, get more. There's geopolitics is complicated. There's all sorts of things, right? We have a major, fleet there. Right? We do lots of stuff in the region. There's a highly, convoluted set of geopolitical relationships in the Gulf states, and the U.S. wields a lot of power. And so it wouldn't be prudent as a matter of statecraft for those countries to like just go all in on Bitcoin as a way to like beat America in this Bitcoin race, right? Like, they were going to want to get like assurances. We want to like get the thumbs up. They're going to want I think in most cases like kind of want to be quiet about it. Let America know, give America a chance to like catch up, announce a position. And then they go, oh, that's a great idea, America. We've just followed you. And we're just a little bit less than you, right? That's kind of what I would expect, right? And so people don't think about this as like, think about this as like a pure sort of arms race. And it's just anyone who gets that first advantage is going to just immediately, like run ahead. And people like geopolitics is much more complicated than that, right? And the differentials of power are, take place in a lot of these other different domains, and countries think about all these different considerations here. But one potential implication of that analysis that I've given, if it's correct, and it's just my kind of interpretation, is that if the U.S. government does go forward with something like Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, and in particular, if it does actually start building a position on top of it, right, like per our draft executive order, I would expect that to then trigger a whole bunch of like these announcements from other countries that essentially would say, hey, we've done something very similar and we've built a position that just is a little bit smaller than the US. And then you could imagine what would happen after that, right? If a few countries start announcing that they've done this, then there is like this sort of domino effect. And yeah, I know this could change, right? This is all people trying to read the tea leaves and position. But yeah, I've heard, Hong Kong is very interested in this subject of a Bitcoin reserve, right? So we've gotten to this point of what seemed like a prima facie kind of absurd, memed idea. Well, like facts change, right? Like once presidents and sheiks and kings and major sovereign pools of capital start to think about Bitcoin as a reserve asset to diversify prudently, some percentage of their portfolio, it's a different regime. And it's prudent to sort of plan for what that would look like, right? Even if it's not guaranteed. It seems to me at this stage a non-trivial scenario. And so it's, maybe that's priced in, maybe it's not, like who knows. But yeah, I think about it because I wouldn't want to be surprised.
Amazing. Well, so this paper will be out on Monday, is that right?
That's the plan. So we're hopefully, we'll try to get it out before Christmas.
This episode is brought to you by Casa. For those of you out there who want to protect your Bitcoin, I want to tell you about Casa, the leading Bitcoin self-custody solution. So if you're serious about protecting your Bitcoin, then you need a rock-solid security plan, and Casa gives you just that. With their multi-signature security and key management services, Casa makes it easier than ever to take control of your Bitcoin without the risk of a single point of failure. They offer multiple levels of protection, all designed with simplicity and ease of use in mind, even if you're not a tech expert. Don't leave your Bitcoin security to chance. Go to casa.io and check out their services today to protect your stack and sleep easy. That is casa.io, which is casa.io. Very cool. Well, make sure you check that out. Check out everything BPI do. Thank you, Matthew. I can't let you go, though, without touching on the UAP thing just very briefly. What the fuck is happening in New Jersey?
Yeah, man. Weird stuff. Yeah, there's a lot there. I'll be brief. So it's not just New Jersey. Obviously, New Jersey has like been the focus of a lot of social media attention. And I think in general, right, like the vast majority of these videos are of conventional prosaic things because most people don't know what a normal sky looks like. Most people don't look. But now that people have been primed to look, they're seeing Starlink terminals, landing lights of nearby airports, planes coming in, Jupiter, Venus, right? Helicopters in the clouds. But there's other things there too, right? That are not conventionally explained. And in particular, over our sensitive military sites. So like Picatinny Arsenal, the Eames depot reported these. Coast Guard boats being followed. We had the entire airspace of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base shut down. You've had 4 Royal Air Force bases in the UK have this panic essentially, where they had to deploy special boat service, special forces units to try to bring their special counter UAS kit out there. Ramstein in Germany was overflown. You've had just like tons of very sensitive sites being experiencing these incursions, right? So this New Jersey thing is just, it's brought a lot of public attention to a concrete phenomenon that's actually happening over restricted airspace and probably other places. But restricted airspace, usually there's people with like counter UAS equipment and they're monitoring it and they detect it. And then if they see things that are very unusual, like Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, there was heavy UAS activity. They deployed their security forces. They like sanitized the airspace. They stopped any other like planes, including like, medical evacuation transport planes from flying over, right? So this is a serious deal. I don't know what this particular circumstance, really is. There is a hypothesis that is, you look back in history, we've had UFO flaps, right? You've had 1952, you've had cases where, you had Belgium, you've had these cases where a certain area just all of a sudden experiences a very anomalous event, right? And the military has experienced these events too, and they're a little bit more documented, but not as public, especially over our nuclear assets, like Malmstrom Air Force Base. We've talked about that before. So the government, this is not a new phenomenon. It's just new in the sense that we have social media and we have cell phone videos that are, create a lot of noise, drowning out whatever signals there. So, yeah, I think there is potentially, truly anomalous things happening, but they're massively obscured by a lot of noise. And so I would look out for, it's going to be interesting to see how the new administration handles this. They are coming in with a lot of senior personnel that are very interested in the UAP topic. So Rubio, who of course was one of the main drivers of UAP transparency and accountability on the Senate Intelligence Committee, helped draft some of those initial bills, with Gillibrand to kind of get this in the National Defense Authorization Act, and working with his colleagues to sort of push the marginal envelope on sort of legislative requirements on the Pentagon and the IC. He's now who's going to be Secretary of State. You have DNI Ratcliffe, who was he's going to be the CIA director, but he was formerly the DNI acting. He's made a number of public comments about these unusual things in the sky, and these are not conventionally explained, and these are not ours, these are not our adversaries. So he's very focused on this issue. Tulsi Gabbard, who's incoming DNI, potentially, she gets confirmed. She's been briefed on this stuff. The National Security Advisor coming in for Trump, Waltz, he's given some statements, very clear about UAP transparency. He's very focused on this. Less a national security position, but very focused on this, has been RFK Jr. Even Vivek is very interested in this. So if I just like rattle down, these names, like there's a lot of interest. And if you just look at Trump's interview with Rogan before the election, there's a very interesting portion of that interview where they're talking about the JFK assassination records and how Rogan says, like, many people are interested in this. And then Trump, unprompted, basically says, many people are also interested in and he looks up the people coming from space.
That's wild.
Rogan didn't prompt that. Rogan didn't bring up UAPs. Trump was the one who directed the transition of the conversation from JFK to UAPs. And he said, people coming from sky, and looked up. And then he sort of went back to his standard talking points about, he's talked to these great looking fighter jets and fighter pilots, et cetera. I know those people that he's talked to. So he knows a lot about the subject. And of course, he came out and gave a very odd statement, right, about the drone thing. Is like, the US government knows what they are. I wish they would just come out and say it, right? Just stop holding people in suspense. Unusual. And he's starting to get the presidential daily brief. And it was interesting. Last point of this. There's a lot. So last year, I think we were talking about the UAP Disclosure Act and most of the action being in the Congress because the executive was basically intransigent on this subject. And it basically came down to the fact that the senior national security leadership, Jake Sullivan in particular, was dealing with a president that was, in their view, like not compos mentis, like not capable of dealing with this issue. And they absolutely did not want this to, become a thing they would have to manage, especially while they're dealing with China, Russia, Middle East. So their policy was like, nope, shut it down, kick the can, not a problem. And so that was where the Senate then had to like kind of do as much as they could to push the envelope and to kind of get this into the public discourse. And that was what Senator Schumer, Senator Rounds in particular were doing with the UAP Disclosure Act and their speech on the floor, and getting some of this momentum around, and then trying to get Aero into a better shape, which is the DoD office that was sort of captured by a lot of these legacy folks, and they want to kind of actually use it to further internal accountability, at least. So now it's shifting more to the executive. Right now, this is a much different game where the Congress is less relevant to this subject than, and they always were. This is always going to come from the president, right? It's always going to have to come from the executive branch. Just no way of avoiding that. And now you've got the senior leadership in place to potentially have that conversation. We'll see whether external events force their hand very soon. So yes, I would expect this to be a issue of focus. And Lou Elizondo even has talked with the family. Right, he was on Don Jr.'s podcast, and the clever strategy now essentially is to use the drone issue and the flap and the government incompetence to potentially like have Trump appoint a like drone UAP czar, right? To kind of, to first order, get, crack skulls together and be like, okay, this interjurisdictional, interagency food fight, Spider-Man gif pointing at each other. It's not my responsibility. I don't have the authority, yada, yada. Like the first order, get that problem sorted at the executive level. But kind of now that you've got that senior person in place and like this sort of drone / UAP portfolio is sort of merged together, then you can go, oh, well, this is actually an adjacent problem set that also comes under this mandate. And I've got the ear of the president. And maybe there's some things that could be put in place kind of under that framework. Right. So I think there's a lot going on now to kind of jockey for position, try to frame, like senior positions or infrastructure. Right. To almost try to do as much as possible via sort of executive action that was sort of written into law on the UAPDA side, right? We'll see how much of this is sort of controlled disclosure and versus how much of this is just deal with it.
But you think we're getting answers soon?
I don't know, man. Answers like the conversations I've had. Again, everyone is in a different position, but I've had conversations with a number of individuals that are very close to the subject, and have a lot of knowledge, both about the core subject as well as the policy sort of, maneuvering around it. And, it goes back to that like quadrant idea of like, almost the same matrix you could apply, which is like, does disclosure happen, in a controlled, slow fashion or an uncontrolled fast fashion? And does it come as a result of U.S. Decision making or non-U.S. decision making? Right. And it's like the ideal scenario is a slow, controlled, US led process. The worst case scenario is a fast, uncontrolled process that is instigated by non-US stakeholders. And maybe you could bifurcate the non-US stakeholders into conventional non-US stakeholders, e.g. China, or non-conventional US stakeholders, e.g. NHI. Those would be the more problematic parts of that sort of breakdown. And I don't know which trajectory we're aiming for at the moment, right? I don't know what probabilities to put on those different boxes yet. And I think, just like with Bitcoin policy, it's prudent to take a hard look at these future scenarios, not let taboo or old anchored mental models distract you from the seriousness of the issue. And then once you take a serious look at the issue and you realize there are different potential scenarios that we're heading towards, are we heading towards the good scenario or the bad scenario, right? And what do we need to do? What can we do now or in the immediate future to steer everyone towards the good scenario? So, and unlike with BPI, like there's few institutions doing that, right? There's one more recent one called the Seoul Foundation, which I spoke at actually. And I would say they're kind of like the BPI of UAPs, right? They're trying to do similar things of like bring together professionals, academics, folks from the government, folks with relevant experience to think through all these different questions, right? Both the implementation mechanisms for disclosure or law or executive action, as well as the international relations dimensions, the socio-cultural, religious dimensions, the financial stability, economic dimensions. And if you think Bitcoin monetizing to reach parity of gold is potentially disruptive, well, I got something else to throw on your plate, buddy. That may require even more prudent planning. And I don't know if we have the institutional capacity to manage that, but I don't know, man. Those are two questions I think a lot about.
Can I just throw one more thing in before we close out? So a while ago, you recommended that I read Lou Elizondo's book, which I did, and it's fucking wild.
Yeah.
But I've heard you say publicly before that you take the name of that book, Imminent, really seriously. Can you just speculate on that for me?
Yes. I mean, yeah, it's a tough one. Like I've heard lots of things, and some things are, it's tough to like put credences on various things. And, I don't want to like just throw things out there that create a tizzy, and it's very thin, like speculation.
That's exactly what
I think there is yeah, but I want to be responsible because I know whatever I say will be clipped into whatever, and people will go, Heinz said X and, whatever. But I think there is an urgency. I detect a sense of urgency by a wide range of folks involved. And it goes back to that quadrant of like, if it's not us, could it be somebody else? And if it's somebody else, well, if it's China, that's a certain thing to manage, a downside geopolitical strategic challenge for us if it was China disclosing some of this information and maybe even doing a performative display of technology that they have that forces us to similarly disclose technology and information. That would be hard to, do in a controlled fashion. And if it's NHI originated disclosure, well then, sorry, man, I can't look through that event horizon. I'll say this. I do not believe we're facing like an invasion scenario. I do not believe that there's like a clock of doomsday, like, ticking in the next year or two, right? Nothing I've been told tells me that that's like a scenario to worry about. But could we be facing disclosures or information revelations that would have a disruptive effect on human institutions just by the nature of us adapting to this new information, that could be quite disruptive very soon. Well, that is a concern that I do have, where it's less of a invasion type thing and more of a, we now all collectively have to radically shift our understanding of reality, and our role in a hierarchy of beings that has a whole bunch of second and third order effects on our individual and collective psychology. And then that starts, if I just think of them in the financial domain, like in one critical function of human financial institutions and instruments is to like discount the future and to sort of have a smooth pricing function for future investments and future savings that dictate essentially the economic machine, right? Like the shape of the yield curve essentially is a reflection of collective human psychology about the the path of our future economic activities. And if there is a revelation that caused us to dramatically change how we discount the future, it's a similar question to like this idea of like superintelligence or highly productive AGI. It's like if it causes a massive disruption to the long run rate of growth, productivity shocks, both in very different sort of potentially countervailing directions, that's going to have a lot of second order, third order effects on the financial market. This would be that, but potentially much more disruptive, right? And so I think about that question of like what sort of circuit breakers, or how would you is Bitcoin the hedge for that scenario too? You can make an argument it is, in the sense that if one downside risk scenario to disclosure in some fashion is it undermines collective belief in current institutions, current political structures, systems of power, the continuity of those government social contracts. Bitcoin essentially is a non-government institution that could help. Maybe if the government had Bitcoin, it's like Bitcoin would benefit potentially from that loss of faith in existing institutions. Where do I hold my money? Bank accounts? Is it gold? Is it it depends like how panicked people get, right? And this is like, all right, is it just moderate panic or like full blown collapse of state institutions, which I would not like. I don't think that's the most baseline scenario, but it has to be thought through. So yeah, other than that, you just shut down financial markets, but that's not great either. Can't do that forever. So people are just going to have to adjust, and there could be a period of adjustment here. I don't know the timing, but it's clear to me this genie is not going back in the bottle. And yeah, you can look at what some things might be coming out of the new administration once they put these people into office. I think they're going to want to first get their arms around what's really going on. And they want to get personal accountability over these activities that, I assume those legacy activities are going to resist that, the new bosses, right? And so there's going to be some, I think, friction, I would expect, but mostly behind the scenes as the new leadership comes into office and wants to wield their constitutional power in a way that they feel hasn't been effectively wielded over these activities. So I would expect to happen first before too much comes out officially from the government, because you want to get accountability, you want to get control, you want to get your arms around everything so that you then have what you think is enough of you have all those different levers and you can pull different levers at a time that you think they need to be pulled. So I would expect that to take place early on in the administration before we get, like Trump isn't going to go to the Rose Garden within a month and be like, yeah, the aliens are real. Here they are. I'm not going to say that. But the last thing I'll say on this is that I was, I've had conversations about what this could look like, and an interesting scenario was painted to me, and I still don't have, my thoughts shift on it. But like one scenario is, imagine a scenario where the government is acting as if this is all true, but doesn't really ever, or doesn't soon say that it's true. They just start to behave as if this is true. Say, for example, you have these technologies in a very, very, very kind of secure, highly compartmentalized enclave with very limited access and, very few engineers and scientists, aware of it. in order to mitigate the possibility of foreign technology surprise, the federal government wants to broaden awareness of historic exotic technology antecedents previously provided by federal government for research and development purposes. Like I've quoted that line before, like that's the encapsulation of the issue here. So they need to broaden awareness. So you bring more people in, you bring more talent, more, SpaceX, et cetera, whiz brains. But you want to do that in a way that still, keeps it secure. So it's not just like a free for all. So you have more of a public-private partnership, expanding the security enclave, acting as if this is all true, and people will probably leak more. People will still come out with will come out with more and more stories about, oh yeah, look at some crazy stuff. But there'll be some more plausible deniability and ambiguity, because people will still be able to say, oh, this is a very clever psyop to cover some crazy engineering project to try to intimidate China. They're winking and nodding that it's aliens, and that's just part of the psyop, right? So that could go on for a while the government kind of plays in that interim ambiguity, brings more people in to try to accelerate technology transition or technology development, scientific discovery, and also has the effect of kind of softening the psychological blow on critical parts of our economic and defense and capital machine. Senior Wall Street, venture capital, big tech companies, they accommodate themselves to this information, and then the rest of society can kind of catch up down the line. That would be the version of the U.S. led kind of soft disclosure, slow process. That seems one scenario that some people have put forward. Seems like a possible idea. But then there's other things that I've heard that's I don't know what to make of it, which is there's a concern of once this reaches a certain point, that's a mad scramble. It's the same thing with Bitcoin. These are nonlinear phenomenon that you can only go so far, and then there's some unknowable tipping point where it just cascades. Either collective belief cascades, individual action starts to shift, and magnify, and you don't know how far you can go in the slow phase before you reach a takeoff phase, right? And I think there's a lot of attention on AI on that question. How far are we on this part of the curve before we get to this part of the curve? There's a lot of attention on Bitcoin. How far are we on this part of the curve before we get to this part of the curve? In the UAP conversation, there's, within certain circles, similar question. How far are we going to be able to stay on this part of the curve before on this part of the curve, right? And I don't know, sociologically, it's very odd to me that those three things are all happening, or all asking the same question: how far are we from the same part of the curve? And could they all just hit that part of the curve at the same time? Well, that would be quite messy for human civilization, but there we are.
Very well guarded. Matthew Pines, thank you very much for that. Where do you want to send anyone who's listened?
I mean, I spew on all this stuff on Twitter at Matthew_Pines. Check out the Bitcoin Policy Institute. It's going to be kind of a crazy year for BPI. I know that they're got an injection of some new funding, so we're going to build out an office in DC with PubKey. So that'll be kind of a crazy new thing that's in DC, kind of like a Bitcoin embassy in DC. It's going to bring DC to Bitcoin and Bitcoin to DC. So it'll be kind of like an event space at the restaurant, the bar, the BPA offices. So that'll be a cool little spot downtown. So yeah, participate that. If you happen to, want some consulting on China cyber and geopolitical risk, hit me up. I'm a director of intelligence at PinnacleOne, the strategic advisory group. But these are all my personal views, not those of SentinelOne. So yeah, that's where I got.
Love it. Thank you very much for that. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, Danny. Love what you're doing here.
Thank you.